join up and they wouldn't feel as though they couldn't.
You're up to date here on GB News. I'll be back with the headlines at 9:30. For now, let's go to the briefing with Tom.
Yesterday's budget was a big moment. A Tory party seemingly more comfortable with high tax and spend. Today on the briefing, we're exploring what it all means and the political implications of everything. We've had reactions from a former Chancellor, we'll have a policy expert, a backbench rebel and a pollster to see what the public think. But first, let's set the scene. A big upset came at the start of Prime Minister's questions yesterday when we learnt that Labour leader Keir Starmer, despite his party's intrepid mask-wearing in the Commons, sadly contracted COVID. Ed Miliband took on Prime Minister's questions, telling the House it's just like the old days. Well, after Prime Minister's questions came the budget, and Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves admirably stepped in for Sir Keir with very short notice. She delivered a reasonable response. One line was particularly funny, accusing the high-taxing Tories of being pickpockets.
It's like one of those pickpocketing operations that you see in crowded places. The Prime Minister is the front man, distracting people with his wild promises. All the while, the Chancellor dips his hand in their pockets. It all seems like fun and games until you walk away and find that your purse has been lifted.
A good gag. A good anti-tax gag. Surprising, perhaps, for a Labour Shadow Chancellor. But the intrepid reporters at the Guido Fawkes website dug up a clip of former Tory leader William Hague using exactly the same joke in 1999. Let's take a look.
Here's the man you meet in the pub who says, "Lend us a fiver and then I'll buy you a drink." He is the pickpocket Chancellor who shakes your hand with a smile after he has stealthily removed your wallet.
Now, come on, Rachel, I know you didn't have that long to prepare, but at least use your own material. Well, sticking with the 90s now, as it seems we are, yesterday following the budget, I spoke to the former Chancellor, Ken Clarke, who says who it's fair to say presided over a series of budgets that were much lower spending and lower taxing. So has the Tory party fundamentally changed? When I put that to him, he insisted it was a more mixed picture, pointing to his first budget, which actually raised some taxes, albeit to a lower level than they are now under Rishi. Let's listen to what Ken Clarke told me in the Commons yesterday.
We didn't boast of cutting taxes and growing the economy. My first budget, I raised taxes by a greater percentage than any other Chancellor had since the war, the national tax burden. But I sweetened it with a cut in income tax. But that's what I had to. Sometimes taxes go up, sometimes taxes go down. When the economic conditions allow, you reduce taxes. No, it's a slight nonsense, like many of the nonsenses that surround the Thatcher and Major governments.
So you're relatively sanguine of the tax burden rising to the highest level it has been since Clement Attlee?
I'm not at all happy with that, but it's inevitable given the damage that Brexit and COVID have done to the economy. And he had to take all those measures like furloughing. And you just remember when you hear public spending announced that this is the taxpayer who's going to pay for this. And sooner or later, it's got to be brought down. You can't keep the total take of tax at 50% of the, getting towards 50% of the whole GDP. But at the moment, the economy is not in a state to start doing it. And he was reasonably prudent in what he announced. I mean, like all chancellors, the spending he announced, he made the most of it, but he was being prudent. I liked what he said about his responsible approach. But it all depends on whether we avoid a long period of inflation and a long period of supply line difficulties.
Yes, the estimate for inflation just 4%, lower than some people were expecting. Is this potentially too positive looking forward? The scarring being only 2, not 3%, GDP growth being higher. Are we being lulled into a false sense of security here?
Well, I hope not, but we could well be. And with all people who start suggesting, as the Prime Minister at one stage, that it'll all be sort of blow out by Christmas, that's all nonsense. The forecasts now are saying the inflation is going to be on average 4% for the next year or so. But there's an obvious danger that it could go higher. And I think Rishi made a point of reminding the Bank of England that it's their duty to get near to their inflation target. Again, he didn't say this, but so long as they don't do it too aggressively when the economy is so weak. But we wait to see. It is very uncertain. But I think we're in for a difficult time with rising costs for everybody, including businesses, inflation, and I don't think all these shortages of key things that we're all suffering from, we're suffering from around the world, they're going to take more than a few months to sort themselves out. So a lot depends on whether the economic recovery is sustained as Rishi is hoping it is.
Now, some of these spending announcements simply rose spending back up to the level that it was in 2010, for example, per pupil funding in schools. Is this just reversing 10 years of Conservative government?
Well, it's reversing some of the effects of the financial crash of 2008. Whichever party had won the election in 2010 would have cut public spending pretty drastically. Alistair Darling would have competed with George Osborne in doing exactly what was done. It's too easy nowadays when most of the parties, certainly the two opposition parties, have no policy on any subject except to spend more money on it, to remember that reality keeps hitting us. And it's good news that we're getting back to where we were, which was a level in 2010, which we all knew then was unsustainable.
Now, just finally, the budget is one of those events in the House of Commons that has some traditions attached to it. And, of course, one of those traditions is that the Chancellor at the dispatch box is allowed to drink alcohol. Now, you were the last Chancellor to actually have taken that opportunity. Why have they all got so boring?
I think the first one was Disraeli. It was a very good, long-standing tradition. Gordon Brown stopped it. I enjoyed it. Kept me fortified me during my speech, having a sip of scotch every now and again. And it was a Scotsman who stopped doing it, and none of them have dared to revive it. It's very sad.
Would you like to see Rishi next year try and revive it? After all, he's reduced the price of a pint of beer. He's reduced the price of a glass of Prosecco. Potentially, that could be a bit of a visual aid.
He hasn't reduced those prices, actually. He's reduced the costs of the people who sell them. We're not going to see cheaper beer in the present state of pubs, that's for sure. But yes, of course, I don't know whether Rishi's up for it, but I doubt it. But you never know. If everything's gone well for him, I think he really should just take the advantage of the privilege of being allowed to take a little skip of scotch in amongst all those sips of water he kept taking.
A sip of scotch. Well, I promise this is water, not anything stronger. Well, listening to all of that was Danny Boxell, the media campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. And Danny, everyone seems to be talking in the context of the higher taxes that we are seeing now as if this was an inevitability of the pandemic. Is that your view?
No, I don't think it should be inevitable that we raise taxes to pay for the pandemic. I mean, what we saw yesterday was a very high spend, high tax budget. Now, I think a lot of people will be saying, you know, we've just come out of the COVID pandemic. A lot of households' budgets have hit quite hard at the moment. A lot of people want to have these sort of like low tax policies that would help them keep more money in their back pockets. And perhaps, you know, the way of getting around that in terms of the fiscal responsibility that Rishi was talking about is going on a sort of more responsible spending angle and then cutting taxes to encourage growth. I mean, you know, we've seen spending increase after the pandemic, but how long is that going to last for? We're seeing national insurance rise coming into place. We're seeing income tax being frozen. Wages are going up, so that's going to drag a lot more people into the tax bands. So I think, you know, a low, stable tax environment is what people are really calling out for at the moment.
So you're saying that these higher taxes could actually discourage growth, could be counterproductive in some areas and make our economy smaller?
Well, yeah, of course, because, you know, a lot of people are talking about the cost of living crisis at the moment. Rishi mentioned it in the budget yesterday. But, of course, you know, the real impact on the cost of living is the taxes that we're facing at the moment. Council taxes going up, national insurance, as I mentioned, income tax, as I mentioned as well. So that's really going to squeeze people's incomes, and it's going to mean that they have less spending power to really, you know, boost the economy as we come out of the COVID recession.
And off the back of the budget yesterday, your organisation, the Taxpayers Alliance, produced a really useful graph where we can see the tax burden over the last 70 years, I believe. Here it is on our screens now, and we can see how high it was at the end of the Second World War and right now we have now reached that point again, the tax burden in the United Kingdom back up to a level not seen since 1950, since Clement Attlee. This is extraordinary under a Conservative government.
Yeah, and if you look at the graph, you can see it's only been going up. There hasn't really been any substantial cuts to the tax burden in the last 10 years or so. So this is a sort of, this is an increasing trend, and it just seems like we're only ever going up. And, what sort of limit we're going to reach? And we had Jacob Rees-Mogg at conference talking to our tent. And he was saying that he thinks that we're now reaching a point where the tax level is going to become too high. So, this is sort of like the limit. We're reaching the limits here of what, the tax take could be. So I think, Rishi really needs to start thinking. He said in the budget that he wants to cut taxes. Well, where is it?
It's interesting looking at that graph. The tax burden falls in the 1980s, then rises, and it's relatively stable throughout all of the 2000s. And it's after 2000 that it starts to tick up. Have the Conservatives really lost the right to describe themselves as a low-tax party?
Oh, I think they have. And, our polling has shown that, most people now trust the Labour Party over the Conservatives in terms of taxation, and taxation particularly for their sort of bracket of income. And, on this graph that we've just been looking at, the period between the 1980s and the 2000s, we had a very stable economic environment. It was very good for business. We did very well economically. And you can see that the impact of that is that we had low taxes, which is why we had a stable tax environment, which meant that we could have a good economic situation for businesses and a stable environment for businesses to...
And it seems that the tax burden sort of resting around 35% of GDP is that. It seems to be relatively stable. That's a nice equilibrium. At what point do you think that it's possible to get back down to that point, to really relieve that burden off the families and businesses of the United Kingdom?
Well, there's nothing stopping us from having it now. I think in the next budget, what we should really be looking at is where we can cut taxes, where we can sort of, make improvements to really boost the economy and go for growth.
Well, let's hope so. Just finally, on this point, the Labour Party has been talking a little bit about cutting taxes. They've said that they want to scrap business rates, although they haven't explained what they'll replace them with. They've been talking about a VAT cut, albeit temporary. They've been talking about opposing the national insurance rises. Is the Labour Party now potentially sounding a little bit more small state than the Tory Party? Well,
yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, I think we haven't had a massive reversal, but it's certainly that both parties are sort of coming more towards the middle. I mean, it's not just about tax and spend. Also, the Labour Party have been very good on waste recently. All the PPE scandals that we had during the pandemic and the council tax as well. The Labour Party is certainly making the right noises. It's just about what kind of policies that they actually want to see, which they haven't really been very clear on at the moment.
I suppose the devil will be in the detail, but
Yes.
the noise is useful. Well, Danny Boxell, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really interesting conversation, and the research that the Taxpayers Alliance does into all of this is absolutely first rate. Now, another significant moment in this budget was when the Chancellor announced that under these plans, foreign aid spending would bounce back to 0.7% of GDP by the end of this Parliament. That's if those fiscal rules maintain and we're able to stay under those fiscal rules. Now, Anthony Magnol is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Tockness who led a backbench rebellion against foreign aid cuts. I caught up with him yesterday in the House of Commons after the Chancellor's speech.
You must be happy.
Delighted. I think the Chancellor laid out how we would return to 0.7%. It is important. It obviously also offers us the opportunity to reform 0.7% and how we spend our aid, because it is important about delivering value for money and making sure we're helping the world's poorest people. So it's a good day for foreign aid.
Now, a lot of people didn't believe the Chancellor when he said, was it last year, that this aid cut would be coming back when fiscal rules were met. Are you surprised that this was actually a significant part of the statement today?
Yes, I was one of those people who didn't believe him, and I may have even compared him to Gordon Brown, so I suspect I owe him an apology. In fact, I do owe him an apology. The Chancellor set out the terms. He is a man of his word. I think this is a principled budget, and over foreign aid, I think he's doing the right thing. I know lots of your viewers won't agree, but I do see the value in what we do around the world, and again, this is a reaffirming our commitment to global Britain, to getting back out there and to helping the world's poorest.
A lot of people will clearly see that there's some parts of our aid budget that are useful. We clearly want to help in certain areas that are hit by natural disasters. There's a huge outpouring of this country, usually, in terms of those particular events. Where people are less happy is when there are richer countries with space programs, potentially, that seem to be getting our cash. Is now the time to stop that once and for all?
I think it's time to look at how we spend our aid and make sure that we're putting it in the places that are most effective. You know, for example, we could reform part of the aid budget to put into the Ministry of Defence to help support British peacekeepers doing the missions that they do overseas. I think we've got to look at the whole board and make sure that people are comfortable with it. And it's my job as a politician to try and persuade people, the taxpayer, that this money is being well spent and has value and has impact around the world.
Now, you mentioned the taxpayer. The tax burden has risen to its highest point since the early 1950s, since Clement Attlee. This under a Conservative government. Does that make you uncomfortable?
It makes it uncomfortable for all of us, and I think including the Chancellor, and that's why he said what he said, which is that he wants to go back to a low-tax economy. He recognises the opportunity to be able to do that. But COVID has forced our hand. We have to take steps that are responsible and allowing people to, allowing the growth to actually develop in this country. So I think it's unfortunate. We will go back there. And again, if the Chancellor can stick to his word on foreign aid, I suspect he can stick to his word about us being a low-tax economy.
Anthony Magnell there, saying that the Chancellor is a man to be trusted. Well, we're hearing a lot about how this government really does want to reduce the tax burden. Honest. Indeed, the Prime Minister yesterday told yesterday's Backbench 1922 committee meeting that every marginal pound will be put to tax cuts rather than yet more spending. If only his recent track record matched that promise. The tax burden is now higher than at any time since Clement Attlee, and Rishi's budget speech seemed at points utterly divorced from reality. My goal is to reduce taxes, declared Rishi Sunak, the man who has just raised the UK tax burden to its highest point in 70 years. Government should have limits, he then thundered to the chamber, minutes after expanding the size of every single government department. It was as if the Chancellor was darting between two different personalities, a minute-by-minute Jekyll and Hyde. Yet it was Mr Hyde who won out, faced with an enormous windfall of £35 billion in extra government revenue, revenue generated through reduced scarring and higher economic growth than expected. The Chancellor decided to push on with tax rises anyway. Growth was 6.5%, not 4%. Scarring was 2%, not 3%. Consequently, the Chancellor was gifted a £35 billion windfall in free cash, and he raised taxes by an extra £15 billion anyway. I don't know if any of you are quick at maths this morning, but 35 billion is bigger than 15 billion. The Chancellor could have cancelled his tax rises and still increased spending, or better yet, paid down some debt. Yet he chose to pursue a higher tax, higher spending plan. There was very little in this budget that couldn't have come from Gordon Brown's time in number 11. It's hard to conclude anything other than this is a pretty Blairite government, albeit with a touch of Brexit. Brand Rishi, as it has become known, slick with media, big spending, but with the occasional sop to the pro-Brexit congregation. Rishi Sunak is just a Brexity Blair. Or perhaps more than that. Countering widespread comparisons to Gordon Brown this morning, The Economist magazine's Mike Bird put it succinctly, if a little cheekily. He said, "I think the comparisons between Sunak and Brown are instructive, but perhaps a tad unfair to Brown, whose revealed preferences suggest that he wasn't quite as comfortable with high taxes as Sunak is." What an absolutely chilling analysis of the Tory budget. A Labour Party more at ease with lower tax than the Tories. Well, we've heard responses in Parliament, but what does the country make of it all? Is any of this cutting through? Was anyone paying attention? And just how popular is Rishi Sunak? Well, let's talk to Kieran Pedley, who's Director of Politics at the market research company Ipsos Mori. We'll be talking to him about research that he has done into Rishi Sunak's popularity. In fact, we have a little bit of data that we can flash up on our screen showing exactly what has happened to Rishi Sunak's opinion favourability in the country. Back where he was incredibly popular just a few months ago, this gap has now narrowed. And those who believe Rishi Sunak, those who have an unfavourable opinion of Rishi Sunak, according to Ipsos Mori, are now just as numerable as those who have a favourable opinion. This man, this Chancellor, who has been known so often as someone who is a popular figure in the Tory party, someone who the Tory party roll out in terms of trying to deliver electoral gains. Potentially, he's no longer that superstar who he was just a few months ago. Potentially, higher taxes are less popular than higher spending. Higher spending might be popular when it is delivered, but guess what? It has to be paid for down the line, and that breeds unpopularity. We'll try and get you our excellent pollster guest as soon as we can. But in the meantime, let's listen to what our London reporter, Alice Porter, had to say about it all.
So you've just watched the budget. What's your initial reaction to it? What were the good things and what were the bad things?
Well, there was certainly some positive things. I was very disappointed about the apprenticeships. I think that he could have spent more airtime on that. He's sort of saying that he wants to do, new roads, new buildings, extend offices, and generally a good sort of infrastructure there. But without the apprentices involved or the skilled labour, it's not going to work. So very disappointed with that. He said he's supporting apprentices, but I don't think he's doing enough on them.
Yeah, because there was a lot on education, a lot of funding for education, but there was a sort of quick reference to apprenticeships and then it sort of carried on, didn't it?
Yeah, I think he sort of glossed over it, if I'm being honest. He did say that he's supporting them, but I'd like to see something a bit more substance to it. And without the apprenticeships, without the skilled labour, none of these things can be put in place. The solar things, all the green, all the heat pumps and everything like that. It's just not going to happen without the labour.
Let's talk about business rates, because there was an announcement about a 50% discount for those in hospitality, those in retail. So that's obviously sort of good news for the high street, different to your line of work. But, does that go far enough, do you think?
I don't think it went far enough, but let's not kid anyone. Brilliant news for retail and hospitality, and they've suffered badly in the last couple of years. And I think it's going to draw people out from their house now and back into the workplace and start, getting on with, enjoying life, going out for meals, going for sort of entertainment, that type of thing. I think very disappointing that he didn't spread it across the board and help all the other businesses, because they've also had 2 years of hell with the pandemic, and I think that would have been a major boost right across all businesses if he could have done a business cut rate on them.
And finally, there was quite an emphasis put on sort of a greener economy and sort of millions set aside for sort of greener industries. In terms of the announcement that we had sort of last week about sort of old boilers, the sort of subsidies for that being to convert them into sort of new pumps, is this the right sort of direction that the government's going? Does it go far enough?
Well, it's the right direction. I mean, we all want it sort of, a lot more cleaner out there and a lot more healthier for everybody. But I'm probably going to go back to what I'm saying, that, without the skilled labour, without the apprenticeships going through, how are they going to fit, the solar panels? How are they going to put all the new pumps in? How are they going to sort of get things, what they're sort of forecasting for? We just can't do it without the skilled labour. But it's a step in the right direction, and maybe it'll stop all them pests sitting in the road.
Charlie Mullins there on all that the budget meant. Well, I'm sorry we couldn't bring you Kieran Pedley of Ipsos Mori. No doubt we'll try and get him back for a future programme to go through exactly the details of that favourability amongst the public, of the Chancellor, his budget and the government at large. Well, coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Maroki, so be sure to stick around for that. But first, it's the weather.
Hello, very good morning to you. Further wet weather is expected today across parts of southern Scotland, northern England, as well as increasingly Wales and then the southwest. It will be another mild day with these humid southwesterlies, but these southwesterlies contain a lot of moisture, and it's over western parts of the UK where that moisture is currently being dumped, particularly over the higher ground. That's why we've seen so much rainfall during the last 24 hours across southern Scotland and Cumbria, and that rainfall continues for a time during the rest of today, with an amber warning in force for that risk of flooding. Wales increasingly seeing the rain turn up here, and across Wales it turns wet by the afternoon. Cornwall as well, and then by the end of the day, western parts of Devon. Either side of that, we've got some rain or showers across the rest of Scotland, but brighter skies in the far northwest as well as Northern Ireland. Staying dry across the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast. Cloudy here, but very mild once again. Here's the rain band, though. It pivots and it starts to move its way into the Midlands. It continues across northern England, Wales and the southwest on Thursday night. And Western Scotland also seeing another feature bring some heavy rain in by dawn. But Northern Ireland sees clear skies, and East Anglia and the southeast also sees clear spells. Mild once again overnight. But a wet start for many, particularly for Scotland, much of northern and central England, Wales and the southwest tomorrow morning. The rain is finally making progress eastwards though, so by the afternoon some showers turn up in East Anglia and the southeast, and the rain or showers ease elsewhere. Brighter skies into the west and feeling a bit fresher. We'll have lost that very mild airflow. However, the weather this weekend stays highly changeable. Further rain or showers, often windy with that as well. And there's a cooling trend. Temperatures will head back down towards average for the time of year.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion